You're listening to Everyday Humanity.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Everyday Humanity. As always, we're so glad you're here. Thank you for continuing to listen to the show and learn more about what we do here at Trotter Ministries. I am Beth, one of your hosts here. I am joined by Regina and Dennis, as usual, and we have a very special guest today. So hello, Regina.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back.
Dennis, you're up. Drum roll. I have a drum roll. Wait, I don't actually have a drum.
That's amazing. Yeah.
Okay.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for listening.
And I think, Dennis, since our guest is to your left, you ought to do the honors of introducing
I would love
Mr.
to.
Meijer today.
Yeah, our guest today is Mark Meijer, and I've known Mark for actually a long time. I don't know if Mark will even remember this, but when I got my paramedic license 30 years ago, Mark gave me a shot at my first job. I was a terrible paramedic, but he took a shot with me anyway, and then we got reconnected through Trotter, and Mark has just been an amazing supporter of the work that we do personally and through Life EMS, and we're just thrilled to have him on the podcast and be able to share a little bit about his passion and his journey.
Well, you're very kind, Dennis and Beth and Regina. Thanks for having me. It's great to be on a podcast. I'm feeling so young. And the sad part about one of the sad parts about Dennis's story there is I had already been driving an ambulance for about 15 years. If he's talking 30 years ago, sadly, I go a few years before that. So. But I did start when I was 17, but nonetheless.
Right.
But anyways, so that's the perspective. But anyways, thanks for having me, and happy to be here.
So happy you're here. And I know bits and pieces. I've been at Trotter for about 2 years. 2 years is coming January.
Okay.
And so I'll tell you, last year was my first turkey drop.
Oh, wow.
So last week we just got done with our turkey drop, our 18th annual. And so one of the very first things I remember seeing is an ambulance pull up. Last year, this is my first turkey drop, right? And I'm like, well, what happened, right? I don't know. Who's hurt? I don't know what's happening here.
I didn't get the memo.
And then the door opens. I'm like, well, what's on the stretcher? I don't even understand. But there, lo and behold, were turkeys, frozen turkeys. So
Correct.
Will you talk to us a little bit about your involvement? Just basically how you came to start Life EMS. I don't even know the backstory.
Yeah. Well, probably don't have time in the full podcast, but anyways, but just to kind of touch on that, when I was a teenager, our family physician happened to be the late Dr. C. Mark Vasu, who he was responsible for training folks that would be in the future called paramedics in Grand Rapids. And some people don't know, but Grand Rapids is one of the first places in the country, literally, to have, again, what would be called paramedics in the future, but non-nurse, non-physicians being trained to help people at a higher level in the emergency setting outside of the hospital, most of the learnings of which came from the Vietnam War and what was happening as far as is the battlefield and frontline care as it graduated to aid stations and all of that. So at any rate, I made the mistake, if you will, in quotation marks, of saying to him when I was in for a physical, when I was 16 or whatever, saying, well, gosh, and as a young guy in high school and whatever, I was enthralled. One of the other parts of the story is that he and the other 5 physicians he recruited to do this initial training, they all had lights and sirens in their vehicles. He had a police radio in his office. And because as they trained folks, they would be available to go out on really critical stuff and also see how everybody was performing, because it was very controversial and all that. So I said, boy, it'd be neat to kind of take some of that emergency medical training or whatever it's called. So 2 seconds later, he's on the phone to the nurse in his office that kind of organized the training for him. Get Mark in a class and whatever. And I'm sitting there going, no. I was just talking big kind of a thing. And so anyways, before I knew it, I was in an advanced first aid class, which was kind of where you had to start. And so did that. and then started. So I was graduating from high school. And decided not to go away to college. I really liked working. I grew up working in the Meijer stores and started there when I was 11. And so I liked working with people. So I started driving an ambulance as well as working in the store, and then going to college here locally, and got under my skin and took the additional training and all of that. Became to operate as a paramedic, and just kind of kept doing it through college. And the other part of the story is a half a dozen of us that were medics at the time. So I'd worked about 5 years or so in the field for another couple of companies. We decided we're young and single, and if we were going to start a business, this would probably be the time.
I was going to ask if that was like a pickup magnet, right? Driving an ambulance. Like, did that get you a lot of dates?
Well, again, I don't think we have time to
okay,
get into that
okay.
today.
It just came to mind. Top of mind.
No, I know. It's just one of those things. But nonetheless, at any rate, it was a lot of fun in operating, in a very independent environment, which it still kind of is, but obviously there's a lot of rules and regulations these days. But yeah, we were, quite independent in work in the ambulance. But then the other aspect that I always tell people helped us a lot is the expectations of our performance was very low because this was all new. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So if we, did some, great care for a patient, whatever. I mean, basically the emergency room in the hospital, so the doctors would be stunned.
Wow.
They weren't expecting that. Right. And so that was a nice thing for us, starting out in that realm. Whereas today, of course, our medics obviously get a lot of formalized training and all of that, and a lot of testing and et cetera, et cetera. And so the expectation that they perform is way up there compared to where we were expected to. So anyways, so that's kind of the nutshell version.
Yeah, thank you. No, I'm visualizing.
Set a bar.
That's set a bar high.
Yeah, you
That's
set a bar.
And geographically, are you just in West Michigan?
Correct. We started in kind of the Metro Grand Rapids area, and so now we're licensed. We operate in 10 counties in West Michigan, and we cover about I think it's about 4,200 square miles from a emergency 911 standpoint, and then we employ about 700 folks, and we started with about 7 of us.
Wow.
So, anyways, but
yeah,
That's huge.
Can we pivot and talk a little bit? I'm really interested in how you got involved in Trotter Ministries. I mean, it sounds like obviously from the perspective of caring and giving back, that I can make that analogy and that equation. But beyond that, when did you start to get involved with Trotter?
When is a great question. And Dennis, maybe you can help with when was Trotter established, I guess, in Grand Rapids to start with?
Yeah, in 1900, so a couple of years before we were running.
Something that's older than me. Great. Okay. That feels good. But is the presence always? I mean, not to where it is today, but right. Is the presence of having a facility in downtown Grand Rapids always been there then?
Yeah, there's always been a presence in Trotter. It's moved locations a few times. Our current main location on 225 Commerce, we sort of describe it as 2 buildings because there used to be an alleyway between the 2 buildings, and since then we built an atrium. But so the one building we secured, or we were actually donated in 1963, I believe. Okay. And then the other building we acquired in the 80s. So that presence, and my guess would be it was probably maybe in that 80s, 90s era.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because so I started in the mid to late 70s working the road on the ambulance, and so. Obviously, a lot of the calls, not obviously, but anyways, we respond to a fair amount of calls in the urban area in taking care of folks that have a myriad of challenges. And so when I first started, I do recall the Salvation Army had a public inebriance facility about Hall and Division-ish area. And so we had a lot of interaction there. And so used to serving the clientele that Mel Trotter serves. And I guess that's kind of maybe where the initial connection came in my mind, from the perspective of, I was, raised to be very respectful of everybody, regardless of their station in life and all of that. And respect the dignity of work and values that Mel Trotter certainly emulates. And so, in the early days, got to take care of some of the patients, responded directly to Mel Trotter, routinely, and took patients to the hospital. And then as we started Life EMS, we started one of the most unique programs with Mel Trotter in the country, literally the first one in the country, and that was transporting medically cleared public inebriants, primarily, or substance abuse patients that are found out in the street, to Mel Trotter rather than to an acute care hospital.
Right.
Nice.
And that was a huge deal, and we had to get a ton of permission from whatever the various regulatory folks, but kind of Mel Trotter's flexibility in doing that, as well as then it allowed me to get a little more up close and personal look at the inside of Mel Trotter's facility and what you all do, as compared to just being there at 3 a.m,
Right.
treating somebody. And so I think those ideals were kind of simpatico with us and how I was brought up. And so anyways, it just was, and then getting to know Dennis and understanding that we're all there to help people, and that let's remove the barriers rather than sit around and think about what all the barriers are. And so, and especially in my aging scenario, I get less and less patient with doing that.
Yes.
Right.
And it's kind of like, okay, we all know there's an issue. Can we just kind of dive in and
Solve
fix
it.
rather than,
Yeah.
is it, 14.5 people or this, no, if it's one, let's deal with it. So anyways.
It's interesting to hear you. A couple of times you've reflected back on the way you were brought up. And I don't think I've ever told you this, but when I was going to Cornerstone to finish my bachelor's degree, I was in a leadership program, and we had this huge project that we needed to do. And part of the requirement of the project was to try to secure interviews with leaders in the community.
Oh,
And your dad allowed me and 2 of my fellow students to interview him on leadership.
really?
And somewhere there's a videotape somewhere that.
Now, what
that
year
has
would
it.
have that have been?
That would have been, I didn't go to college right after high school, so that would have been like 95-ish, 96.
Oh, okay.
And so your dad allowed us to come in and to put a video camera out and to talk to him and have him talk to us about leadership. And the thing that sticks out all these years later is I remember your dad making a strong point about, you have to treat people in the way that you would want to be treated. You have to treat people well, whether it's your
Right.
customer or whether it's your employee. And you don't sort of try to go, what's the lowest amount I can pay this person for? You have to treat them well. And hearing you now talk about the way you were brought up and getting to know you all the years and how I know you run Life EMS, it's like that. Your parents really did instill that in you because you're doing that same thing.
Well, you're very kind to say that, but being blessed with that upbringing, and that's why when we started Life EMS, people say, well, what were you thinking, or whatever. There were 5 other ambulance services operating at the time, whatever. But those of us that started the company, we wanted a respectful place to work, and for us, especially kind of being on the front edge of this, kind of new type of pre-hospital care, where a lot of people were looking pretty with skeptical eyes at us, like, can these guys really do that? I mean, we were doing stuff, that had never been done outside the hospital, whatever. But and now it's routine for our folks. But anyhow, so we were always, as medics, eager to get a level of respect for what we did, and things that made an impression on me along the way in emergency medical care was before we started the company, and I still remember clearly a dear friend or someone who became a dear friend, Dr. Luis Tomatis, who was literally the first heart surgeon that came to Grand Rapids to start an open heart surgery program at Butterworth. When he came to town, and started this practice, there was no such thing as trauma surgeons in those days. But being a heart surgeon, opening the chest up and whatever, he's a, thoracic surgeon by training and necessity as well as vascular. So at any rate, so if it was a bad car wreck or a shooting or something like that, he may be one of the folks that would come in at 3 a.m. And so I always remember as a young teenager working at Bud's Ambulance and whatever, and 3 a.m. we'd be bringing somebody in, and sometimes some of the hospital staff may kind of be edging us out when Dr. Tomatis walked into the room to, what's going on, what happened, and he would look at us and just say, Mark, tell me what's happening here, and that level of respect for those of us that are kind of going, geez, I'm just a kid with a little bit of training, kind of a thing. But at any rate, those kinds of things just stick with you. And so when we started Life EMS, we wanted to have an environment where the expectation within the organization was to treat each other with dignity and respect, because that's how we wanted not only to have the work environment be pleasant and fun, but also that's how we wanted to treat other people, just as you said, just as we wanted to be treated. And you can't have that expectation if you don't
walk
do
the
it
walk.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and live it. So that's been the fun part of the journey, is to try and we're far from perfect, obviously, but try and have an organization where we have that as our foundational reason for being. So
I wonder what, because you seem like, you have a well of knowledge, and you've been.
I'm really fooling you, Regina.
Well, you fool very well. And just talking about like the history and how Life EMS came to be. Can you talk about like what was that moment, that defining moment for you, and then the other folks who you connected with to build Life EMS as it is today? What was that moment that was confirmation? Like, yep, through trials, tribulations, stumbles, having to restructure and reimagine things. What was the moment that you knew that you were on the right trajectory, and that you were doing something that's cutting edge, something never done before that you talked about? But what was the confirmation moment for you?
Wow. That might be a little bit over my head, but no. I mean, it's a great question, and I don't know if there was a defining moment, but it's hard because we never think that we have succeeded.
Yeah.
So, and I've been counseled before about needing to celebrate our success.
Absolutely.
So, at various points and whatever. But I'm always, just because of the challenges of helping start the business and some of the brick walls that we ran into, that at times, we didn't even know if we were going to be licensed to operate because of some local politics and what have you. So I'm always waiting for the other shoe to drop, sadly. So I'm like, well, we got recognized for this, great, whatever. We were one of the first ambulance services in the country back in the early 90s to be fully accredited. And so that was a big deal and whatever. And so, but again, to your point, it's kind of, trying to make ourselves, recognize that. Mm-hmm. So, but anyhow, it to me, kind of the overriding thing, and we talk about this in our orientation with new folks, from a getting hooked into doing this kind of work was growing up working with people, having that foundation. But then to me, it's always amazing that, especially, when I was very, very young, that Mrs. Smith or a family or what have you would invite us into what's probably the most tragic, intimate part of their life, as perfect strangers, just based on the uniform that we're wearing.
Mm-hmm.
Wow! And so that's the foundation we lay with our new folks. That's where you start. Now you've got to live up to that trust.
Yeah.
Wow! And you have the opportunity to walking into somebody's home to lose that trust in a second, just by your body language or whatever. And so encouraging our folks that we're in the helping business, we're not in the judging business. Mm-hmm. And so that to me always struck me, especially when I was working for first ambulance service I worked at was called Bud's Ambulance.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So that conjures up all sorts of images in your mind from a a few of us always said we started an ambulance service, we'd call it Life or something like that, not Bud's Ambulance, Mark's, whatever. So anyways, but running around, so to speak, responding to emergency calls with another 18-year-old, and we were trained to do all of the stuff that paramedics can do these days, basically, that was available at that time. And I'm thinking, if Mrs. Smith knew that these two 18-year-old kids were coming to her house, she would just say, you know what? I think, I tell you what, I'm going to have my husband drive me in. Is that okay? So anyway, but the gravity of that just, it always kind of struck me like, wow, it's pretty cool, but kind of, mind blowing sometimes, but.
And one of the reasons why I think we have such a natural connection between life and Mel Trotter and us individually is something you just said. When you said you're telling your new medics, we're in the helping business, not the judging business.
Right.
And that's exactly the same thing at Mel Trotter, right? There's a lot of people out there that will judge, but to something you were saying earlier, a lot of people that are doing judging aren't helping.
Right. That's a great way to put it.
And given the choice, I would rather not judge and help someone than stand back, judge, and not provide help. Mm-hmm. So it's just another way, reason why we work so well together, because we have that foundation.
No, exactly. And both of us have the opportunity to see people at their best and worst, if you will. Yeah. And so nobody's calling us as an emergency medical service provider on their best day.
Right.
So, and we just have to recognize that. And I try and describe generically to our new folks that, part of what we do, of course, is so-called accidents, which, we can debate whether anything's an accident, but nonetheless. But at any rate, so we may roll up to an intersection and see a, motorcycle halfway up a telephone pole and whatever. And so, yes, naturally, maybe your first inclination is to say that, what were you thinking? Yeah. But that's not why we're there.
Yes.
We're there to help fix them and get them safely to the hospital. And so at any rate, that's the, I think you have to have that perspective, because if you don't, it's very hard to help people, I think, as well as I think one of the other kind of cornerstones, besides, not judging people, is And now I just lost my train of thought. Sorry.
Happens to me all the time.
For everybody on the podcast, I have very gray hair. Sorry. But at any rate, but I mean, besides the non-judgmental perspective, is the minute you put blinders on in assume, one of the cardinal sins of the ambulance business is never assuming, of course. The minute you assume a certain perspective, you're going to be wrong.
Right.
Yeah.
In where I was going to trail into, sorry, was early on in the days of those of us that were working as what would be called paramedics. There was a time when people said, "Well, how do you deal with the stuff you see and whatever?" And some people used to say, and they'd make a big deal that it was kind of a macho type of work, and there was very few women at the time, frankly. When I started, there was no female paramedics, literally. I mean, there was, whatever. And we hired one of the first ones in the area, but nonetheless, they would say, well, you have to be hardened to that. It's like, well, no, if you lose your compassion, kind of back to what we were talking about before, you just can't do this job well.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so you can't be hardened to it. Do you have to control your emotions at the time? Absolutely. But man, if it doesn't affect you, you're in the wrong business. And so that's a tough thing for some of the young EMTs and paramedics, I think, to conceptualize, is that it's okay to cry, it's okay to get sick, whatever. You just have to maintain that control at the time. But if you can't show those emotions, that's a problem. And so, and as a little tangent, we were one of the first EMS organizations where we embraced, and we have a very robust team of critical incident stress management debriefing folks to recognize that it's an issue. And so anyways, but
yeah, I hear you talk, and the whole time I'm replaying the verse in my head. It's my absolute favorite verse in scripture, which is Micah 6:8, which is act justly, love mercy, and walk humbly, right? And you talked earlier about stop talking about it. Like, I want to see some action behind this, right? If we're going to affect change, if we're going to help people, we can talk all day long about it, but what are we doing about it to actually step out and help? And so many parallels have been drawn as I listen to your story. So thank you again for sharing it. But I want to roll up all the way back to when you were in, I think you said maybe it was an office, a medical office, and the doctor said, hey, go enroll Mark in some classes, right? Like right away. So he heard you have just an inkling of interest. And to us, right away, I make the analogy of our workforce development program. It's like, if somebody has an interest in saying, I want to do this, let's help them get there, right? That's action. And so look at where it has led you. And so I also heard you say about growing up in a family that actually encouraged this kind of, action and helping people. One of the things that Regina is, I don't know if you know, but is in charge of working with our youth that come to Trotter Ministries, 18 to 24. And so many of those individuals have been raised in families that did not have that upbringing, right? As you can imagine. Tough stuff. And so it's just the barriers, and how do we step out and help to remove those barriers? And so you were just the epitome. You're actually doing it. And so those parallels were really strong for me as I sat back and listened to your story.
Well, thank you. But the challenge that you all have from helping encourage those young people that have had a tremendously difficult road, saying, listen, you can do this, rather than wallow in whatever. And I think that's again where we appreciate and identify with Mel Trotter's role to give people, as you described it, Dennis, a hand up rather than a hand out, to get them rolling. And these 14 people before Regina may have tried to get those young people rolling. Nobody had success. But somebody, was able to click, and and we all love to see that interest in somebody else. Okay, and it's like, all right, we're gonna, stop everything right now. We're gonna get him or her in a class of whatever, and get rolling and stuff. But but yeah, so we appreciate the fact that you guys really at Mel Trotter Ministries walk the talk, and that's the moral of that story, I think.
I've been thinking a little bit today about the fact that help leads to hope, right?
Yeah.
But you have to have the help before you can help somebody have hope, right? And so that's really what we're talking about here. So the one thing I don't like about these podcasts is it's so good, but it's over so quickly, and we're getting to that end. So
I can edit most of my stuff out.
No, you're the guest star. Are you kidding me?
But I have to ask a burning question that I am sure that all of our listeners want to know before we end this.
Here we go.
All right, here's the question. The penny horse at Meijer is named Sandy.
Correct.
Who picked the name Sandy?
It's a great question. I do not know the answer to that question.
Not like the first
You heard
girlfriend
it
you
here
picked up in
first.
the ambulance?
Pardon me?
I said, wasn't like the first girlfriend you picked up in the ambulance?
No, the penny horses predate me.
Okay.
Trust
All
me.
right, okay.
So I may be old, but
Don't judge me, Mark. You talked about judging. Okay.
Well, but from the one thing I will disclose to you all is that I have two older brothers, and so I was the last boy to be born, and so each time all three of us were born, my mom said, "I'm for sure having a girl." So at any rate, so when Mark came along, same thing. And anyway, one of the doctors that helped deliver me is funny, Ray Lang, who was one of these half a dozen doctors that taught us. He was an OB guy, whatever. So of course, me as a teenager, he's doing the childbirth part of the advanced first aid class, and I said, "Well, you helped deliver me. Do you recognize me?" But anyways, but the point being is the bullet that I dodged is that my name would have been Sandra Joe. There's anything wrong with Sandra Joe, but if I would have been a girl.
Yeah.
So maybe that's where Sandy though.
Well, maybe my mom always had that Sandra in her mind.
Right.
And I'm not sure. That's an interesting question, but I was just kind of happy that Sandra Joe was not going to be my handle in the future.
Right. And I promise I will never call you Sandra.
Me either.
I've been called a lot worse.
You and me both. Well, we are coming to the close of our time, and Mark, I'm going to throw it to Beth in a minute to close, but I just want to say thank you. Thank you for what you give and do to this community, for this community. Thank you for being more than a partner to Mel Trotter. You invest in the work that we're doing, and you are a huge blessing to us, and you allow us to do what we're doing. So just want to say huge, personally and professionally, just a huge thank you to you. And I'll let Beth close us.
Our honor.
Yeah, and in the spirit of the Thanksgiving season, we are obviously very involved with our turkey drop event.
Yep.
And we have our large community meal at DeVos Place, right, whereby we're helping the community. We're going to be in community, in person this year again.
Well, I know.
Last
Great
year,
to see that it's back.
Yes, we're so excited. So I guess just one final question is, what is something that you're giving thanks for this year, Mark?
Oh gosh, I mean, I certainly give thanks for our family and my wife and daughter. I mean, it just that's kind of where everything starts, and very blessed and pinch myself often, and and growing up, in West Michigan and with the parents that I had and whatever, and my mom is still alive, bless her heart, and so I can't tell you her age because I did that about
trouble.
7 years ago and got in big trouble, and I thought it was an honor. But anyways, but no, it's just just being able to do what we do and help people and be allowed to do that is a privilege we can just never repay.
Absolutely.
So as it says in Scripture, it sounds like in everything give thanks. And like Dennis said, we are very thankful for you, very grateful for all you do for Mel Trotter Ministries, and thank you for being here with us today.
Well, thanks. My honor. Thanks you guys for having me. Appreciate it.